Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Edda L. Fields Black, celebrating the release of her new novel, COMBEE, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. Dr. Edda Fields Black teaches history at Carnegie Mellon University and has written extensively about the history of West African rice farmers, including in such works as Deep Roots, Rice Farmers in West Africa and the African Diaspora. Fields Black is a direct descendant of Africans enslaved on rice plantations in Colleton County, South Carolina, and black soldiers who fought in the Civil War, including her great-great-great-grandfather who fought in the Combahee River Raid. Dr. Fields Black will be joined in conversation by Dr. Paul Gardullo. Paul Gardullo is a historian and curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. He directs the NMAHC Center for the Study of Global Slavery, and he was the project director for an exhibition entitled Make Good the Promises, Reconstruction His Legacies, and the companion volume that accompanies the exhibition, which is on sale behind the register. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Dr. Edda Fields Black and Dr. Paul Gardullo.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and to see you all. Wonderful to be back in DC. I want to thank Dr. Paul Gardullo for joining me today. Paul and I have worked on projects at the Smithsonian. We've worked on a symphonic work that I'm collaborator of, and it's always a pleasure to sit down and chat with Paul. So I'm so happy he's here today. Beginning around 9 p.m. on June 1st, 1863, Harriet Tubman's Spies, Scouts, and Pilots piloted one gunboat and two transport steamers through the Beaufort River, navigating during the springtide by the light of the full moon, which shimmered off the water. The springtide's highest high tides of the lunar cycle opened up the Combahee River's narrow channel. Then they took a risky shortcut and went up the Coosaw River. It was risky because the Coosaw River was lined with sandbars, but it saved them hours and reduced the amount of time they could have been exposed to Confederate fire on the river. But it came at a cost. One of the transport steamers, the Sentinel, ran aground mid-tide and had to be left behind. They couldn't wait 3 hours to dislodge it. This must have been devastating for Harriet Tubman and the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. It meant that the U.S. Army could only rescue half as many freedom seekers from the prison house of bondage. The gunboat, the John Adams, and one transport steamer, the Harriet A. Weed, proceeded up the Combahee River, steering around the wide bends and tight curls of the Serpentine River with the marsh on one side and the cypress swamps on the other, and the glistening river in the middle. Early on the morning of June 2nd, they stopped 20 miles upriver, first at Fields Point, no relation, at the site of black troops carrying muskets. The Confederate pickets ran so fast, they left their blankets behind, according to one newspaper account. They sent couriers back on horseback to Chisholmville, 10 miles away for reinforcements. A company of 2nd South Carolina Volunteers and their commander disembarked and held Fields Point down, skirmishing with Confederate reinforcements throughout the day. The second stop was 2 miles north of Fields Point at Tar Bluff. Another company of 2nd South Carolina Volunteers disembarked, skirmished all day at Tar Bluff and on the road leading to Ashipoo Village with Confederate pickets. But they held it down too until the U.S. Army boats returned by making the Confederates believe their troop strength was larger than it was, and they burned the estate homes and outbuildings on 2 plantations, including the rice mill on Oliver Middleton's Launch Plantation. Then the 2 boats left, continued up the river, with the marsh on one side and the rice fields on the other. As they entered Colleton, a 2nd South Carolina Volunteers captain, William Lee Apthorpe, reported he saw the rice field sprinkled with woolly heads of enslaved people hard at work. It was 4 a.m. At 5 a.m., Joshua Nichols was asleep in his bed on Longbrow Plantation when his enslaved driver barged into his bedroom and delivered news Nichols was not prepared to hear and most feared. The U.S. Army's Harriet A. Weed was approaching Nichols' boat landing. He told the enslaved man to run to the rice fields, where the enslaved people were already hard at work, though they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces, or the snakes or alligators nipping at their feet. Nichols declared he would gather up the house slaves. They would meet in the woods to hide. The house slaves professed their attachment to Nichols, then refused to follow him. They packed their meager belongings. The field hands and the driver went with them to the boat. The black soldiers and their white commanders put boots on the ground at Longbrow. Nichols wrote he was unarmed, and he had no means to compel the bondspeople to obey him, and no means to protect himself from the armed black soldiers. So he ran to the woods to hide alone. From there, he had a panoramic view of his and his neighbors' plantations burning to the ground. The Army sent out rowboats from Nichols' plantation to James Paul's plantation, a few miles away. From there, an 88-year-old enslaved man named Minus Hamilton was one of the enslaved laborers in the rice fields. Weeks after the Combahee River raid, Hamilton told Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers that he and all of the enslaved people were hoeing rice when, quote, Lincoln's gunboats came, unquote. Then every man dropped his hoe and left the rice. Like Joshua Nichols, the overseer on Paul's plantation, told the enslaved people to run to the woods and hide. The Yankees had come and would sell them to Cuba. While he hid, afraid to be seen, the enslaved people openly defied his orders and ran straight to the boat. This day was certainly a day that the elderly man never thought he would see. He was in rapturous awe at his first sight of young black men in uniform, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, who Minus Hamilton called, in his perfect Gullah dialect, de brack soldiers so presumptuous. They came ashore, their heads up, then burned the plantation house, the barn with last year's rice crop in it, stables, cookhouse, storeroom, every building on the place owned by the enslaver who held him in bondage. They burned it to the ground. Minus Hamilton said he didn't care anything about the enslaver's holdings, didn't care anything at all. He was going to the boat. He regretted leaving his 2 blankets, his only worldly possessions, regretted that he and his wife only had the clothes on their backs and the scarf on her head, but they were going to the boat. He ended his life story wryly. He was old, he said, but not too old for freedom. He was thankful for the young folks, those black soldiers so presumptuous, who could get to freedom by force, but he and the old heads had to go slow. The gunboat, the John Adams, proceeded up the Combahee River and parked at Combahee Ferry. Here, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers and the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery encountered Confederate pickets who fired shots and sent couriers to telegraph Green Pond for reinforcements. Less skirmishing ensued on this end of the river because the John Adams, with its small guns, commanded both the river and the causeway. The ragtag retrofitted gunboats' guns weren't anything like the U.S. Navy's firepower, but they were enough to hold the Confederates at bay. Rowboats were sent out to Newport and Bonnie Hall plantations with the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery aboard. Without troop strength, the Confederate troops focused on notifying planters and overseers along the river and helping them keep enslaved people from getting to the boats. One overseer shot and killed an enslaved girl on Bonnie Hall plantation as she was trying to get to freedom. However, the U.S. Army did not lose a single life. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers proceeded to Cypress Plantation. And for several reasons, I think that Cypress was actually the target of the raid. So I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A. There was a long, narrow causeway from Cypress Plantation to the pontoon bridge with rice fields on both sides. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers walked valiantly across the causeway, fully exposed to the Confederate pickets' fire. Some of the soldiers had liberated themselves only 2 weeks before the raid. They had all gotten their muskets and Union blues a few days before. Yet they walked across the causeway, these black soldiers so presumptuous, to Cypress Plantation. Among them was Friday Hamilton, who had liberated himself from enslavement on Cypress months before the raid, leaving his parents and sister behind. Friday joined Colonel Montgomery before the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers was organized, and he went back across the causeway to rescue his family. After destroying everything on Cypress, except for the slave quarters, the black soldiers marched all of the enslaved people there back over the causeway to the safety of the John Adams and to freedom. The enslaved people on Cypress testified in their pension files that they and the people held in bondage on Newport Plantation got on the gunboats together. They had attended each other's weddings, greeted each other's newborn babies, and gone to the Praise House together for years, though they lived across the river from each other. On June 2nd, 1863, they went off to freedom together. At Combahee Ferry, Confederate pickets came across the pontoon bridge, but the John Adams fired at small guns and deterred them from coming any closer. Then men of the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery cut the bridge from its moorings and set it ablaze. When the John Adams pulled away from Combahee Ferry, sailed downriver to Longbrow Plantation, and picked up the Harriet A. Weed, not everyone had been able to get on the boats. Remembering that the 2nd transport steamer, the Sentinel, ran aground on the Coosaw River, some people who had run to the river with their meager belongings, wrapped in bundles and toted on their heads, and tried and clamored to get aboard, got left behind. The John Adams and the Harriet A. Weed took the mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunties, uncles, cousins, sweethearts, and a few baby mamas off to freedom in Beaufort, leaving the prison house of bondage behind. In all, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers destroyed 7 rice plantations on the Combahee River. 756 enslaved people ran to the river when the uninterrupted pipe of the steam whistles blew and liberated themselves. It was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history and the second only to the Haitian Revolution in the entire New World. Thank you.
Good evening, Edda.
Hi, Paul.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here with you and hear that amazing historical account. The largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, second to the Haitian Revolution. And I think I want to talk today about history with you. I also want to talk about how you write history. And finally, I want to talk about memory, and why this is important for us to remember today. And so we're going to take those in order. I'm going to leave plenty of time for your voices and your questions as well. But after listening to that beautiful reading that put us right in the middle of the Combahee River Raid, right in the middle of the U.S. Civil War, that put African Americans, both enslaved and free, at the center of that, I was inspired. I'm inspired to invoke another Black woman writer from 150 years ago, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And a few years after this account, or this action in Philadelphia, she talked about what she deemed was necessary for national salvation. And she was in Philadelphia, and she spoke about focusing our attention on Black people in America. That those people, and she used the term, she used industriousness, their greediness for knowledge, she says, their passion for justice, for freedom. That is what the nation needed to focus on. And I think that is what you focus on here. And I want to ask you, why is that important that we center these people? Why, and what does it do for us what does it do for us when we center this story and these people's story?
Thank you for that question. One of the things that I kept coming back to as I was writing COMBEE was that Harriet Tubman, who had risked her life already 13 times and rescued around 70 people for freedom. And these were family members, these were members of her community, these were people who she knew, that her family knew for most respects, in the Maryland Eastern Shore. Why would she go to Beaufort and take the ultimate risk, if you will, risk her life, risk her freedom for people she didn't know? And I think the same question should be asked about the 75% of the 186,000 Black soldiers who fought in the Civil War of the U.S. colored troops, including the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, but I'm lumping all of them together. These formerly enslaved men who went back into what I borrow from Frederick Douglass, the prison house of bondage, and risked their freedom and their lives for other people. I think the depth of that sacrifice, the depth of that devotion, the depth of that risk is something that we can't even fathom today. So when you talk about Frances Harper Watkins saying that we need to center freedom, I think that she's saying that we need to center these Black people, African Americans, as historical actors who were not waiting for President Lincoln. They weren't waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation. In the coastal South Carolina and Georgia area, they weren't waiting for the Confiscation Acts. They weren't waiting for Congress. You know, they took any opportunity that was available to seize their freedom. And even once they were free, they then took the opportunity to go back and help other people who were still enslaved. The raid takes place 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. I think we should just pause right there and ponder that.
Yes.
That the overwhelming majority of enslaved people were still enslaved, right? After the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And that by the end of the Civil War, 500,000 formerly enslaved people had liberated themselves and were behind Union lines. These people had risked their lives for freedom.
Yeah, I mean, that's powerful. And I think what's also very powerful about what you've done is you've used the Combahee River Raid as a fulcrum, as a moment, but your history reaches backward to talk about this longer struggle of freedom, and forward in time to talk about the continuing. struggle of freedom, because the end of slavery did not mean full freedom. And I think that recognition that you're centering a moment and centering many moments that provide opportunities to demonstrate agency, but also to demonstrate, I won't even call them broken promises, maybe a continuation of unfreedom is the proper way to think about that. What is it that that attracted you to COMBEE, to be that fulcrum point?
COMBEE, to go back in hindsight, I was actually working on something else, and I was minding my business. And maybe the best things happen when you're minding your business and doing something else. I was, first of all, working on the libretto of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice. And my collaborator, 3-time Emmy Award winner, John Weinglass, is in the back. Thank you, John. The composer of Unburied, Unmourned, Unmarked, Requiem for Rice. I was working on the libretto on which that original score is based. And I was looking for dramatic scenes through which I could tell the story of Rice and slavery. I was working on another book that I wanted to be a history of Gullah Geechee. And the Requiem was growing sort of in a lot of different ways. It was just growing and taking me into different directions. And the Gullah Geechee book was growing and was taking me, it was growing in terms of rice, not rice, Sea Island cotton and indigo and things I wasn't really interested in. No offense. I'm a rice girl, what can I tell you? And I needed to bring the two into closer alignment. And the Combahee River Raid was where they intersected. And I didn't think that I thought, okay, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, what could I say that's new about Harriet Tubman's life? Right? What? Really? Everything's been written. And I started digging around in some primary sources, and I dug around in some pension files, made a trip to the National Archives. I pulled, I think, 7, no more than 10 files. And in the first file that I read several months later, the Combahee freedom seekers were testifying about the raid. And I said, that's it. Maybe there is something here. I have never seen these cited anywhere before. So I have to find out more, but I think there's something there.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great segue into talking about process and talking about how we know, what we think we know, and what we still have to learn. And that was phenomenal to me, because I think, I was inspired. Well, let me start here. Do you all know it was the anniversary of W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday yesterday? 155 years. When I approached this book, Black Reconstruction was one of the first things I thought of when I heard Edda was working on this book. But this book reveals so much more in both what we might call the traditional archives, but also non-traditional archives. And so I'm wondering a little bit about, if you could just tell us about your process. If you could take us into one story. You mentioned the pension files. I think there's an incredible amount of information to be gained about history that we think we've lost in those files. I also think there's an incredible amount of history and learning to be gained from being on the ground. And I wonder if you could take us to those two places for a little bit in your journey of your writing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as I mentioned, I started with the pension files, and in my first set of acquisitions, found these files in which formerly enslaved people from the Combahee are testifying about the raid. They testified about what happened on June 2nd, 1863, where they were, where they had been enslaved, who got on the boat with them, what the men did after they got to Beaufort, which is join the army, with whom they joined the army. They ran the whole thing down. This is, it's a process. So I had to keep reading. I needed more files. I didn't have a very big research budget. I partnered with the International African American Museum's Center for Family History, which was acquiring the files of the Black soldiers in the South Carolina regiments. Tony Carrier is the founding director, and I was able, through IAAM, to acquire files from the entire regiments of G&H, which are the two companies that were formed after the raid. I didn't, I'm typically work in alphabetical order. I did not do that this time. What I did instead is, as I read files, I used a network approach. So people would testify for veterans. The soldiers identified themselves and the companies they were in. I would request their files. And so I'm deepening my knowledge of these companies. And these are the two companies that are formed after the raid. During COVID, I guess I had nothing better to do, so I started sampling files in companies A through F. And these are the companies that fought in the raid, which include 34C, and my third great-grandfather, Hector Fields, enlisted in 34C in March 1863. I quickly surmised that there was a lot in these pension files, and this was an enormous amount of data. Some files are 13 pages long, some are 300. 90% of them are written in cursive. I was going to only read it once. So I had to go to the dean and get some money to hire some graduate students. And from day one, I was doing full text transcriptions and starting a database. The database ended up having about 40 columns as I saw these questions developing, and I would plug the text transcriptions into my database. Everybody who testified in the pension files in these companies was in my database. I also sampled the 21st Regiment. I sampled the 128th Regiment. I sampled all the South Carolina regiments because they testified, right? The soldiers came in and testified for each other. And so it's not only in one soldier's file that you get the details, it's from when that soldier testifies for somebody else. That's often the place where they tell their story, how they're related to this person. Maybe they were sold with this person. Maybe they grew up with this person somewhere else, right? So it was that somewhere else, I started noticing that a number of the Combahee freedom seekers are testifying that they're not born on the plantations from which they escaped. And so that gave me the idea that I wanted to track these people. Because this is kind of what I do, rice and slavery, I wanted to tell the story of their lives before the raid. Yes. And the pension files are not only telling me about the raid and about freedom, but they're going back into slavery. They're talking about their lives as enslaved people, their intimate lives, their family lives, the names of their family members. They're going back 3 and 4 generations.
Yeah, and I think that, we often hear about the inaccessibility of that the wall of data, if you will, and we've all heard this as historians, maybe even as genealogists, if there are some of you who are interested in family history. there's information to be found. And I think that was inspiring. And you talk about, I was interested in writing a book that wasn't about what we can't know.
Right.
I was interested in writing a book about what we can know and what I found out. And I think there are interesting lessons here for more than just professional historians. And I'm so inspired that it came about through a place like the Center for Family History, the International African American Museum. Our museum has a Center for Family History as well, and partially inspired by Tony Carrier's great work. Mm-hmm. But I want to take just a minute, because you talked briefly about the Requiem, mm-hmm. and the way in which you were inspired outside of just the archive. And I'd like to ask you about the power of place, and how your interaction with the landscape helped shape the writing of this book and the story you tell.
Mm-hmm. Well, you and John Weinglass have a lot to do with this. In working on the Power of Place exhibit and really trying to think about how the environment and the place, the rice fields, actually shaped the lives of enslaved laborers was very influential in my thinking. And then as we're writing the Requiem, John and I running around in the rice fields in South Carolina, in Gambia, in Senegal, and recording sounds. How many years had I spent in the rice fields and I didn't know there was sound? I didn't think about the birds. I didn't think about the critters. I didn't think about the water gushing out of the irrigation system. But these were sounds that we recorded for the Requiem. And I also, okay, so you want to talk about me. It was very important for me to tell the story of the raid from the perspective of the freedom seekers. And so that's another thing that's very powerful about the Pension Files, is that formerly enslaved people talking about their time in bondage from their own perspectives, which we've never seen before and historians had thought was inaccessible. I wanted to be on the ground on the Combahee. I wanted to understand the river and the rice fields and the experience of waiting for the boats as much as possible from the perspective of enslaved people. Because I've worked on rice for such a long period of time, because I have, deep relationships with people in coastal South Carolina, I was able pretty quickly to contact the current owners of these 7 plantations and gain access. I lived on one of them, so Nemours Wildlife Foundation is another partner. I was in residence at Nemours for about 18 months, and I wasn't continuous, but I came down at one stretch for 10 days out of every month. I was there. I was there through the entire year. So if you think about an agricultural cycle from beginning to end, I was in those rice fields for every stage of the tide, every season, recording sounds, looking at the grasses, the critters. I saw the alligators when they were born and then they were, big, all of that. Through Nemours and through other partners like our friend, Dr. Travis Falk, I work with a group of scientists in South Carolina and North Carolina. We were literally in the rice fields, and I got the opportunity to go up the river and do a reenactment of the raid. I think 3 times we reenacted the raid under the full moon, going 6 or 7 miles an hour, no lights, no gadgets, no nothing. Then the next morning we redid it with a different set of friends, and we ran aground at the mouth of the Coosaw River. So we had the full experience. And lastly, I talked about Joshua Nichols. When the Harriet A. Weed comes up to his boat landing, it goes through a canal. These rice fields have canals, and the canals would have been used for transporting rice, right, to get it out to market. And the Harriet A. Weed came up a canal in the rice fields. So we reenacted the raid coming up the canal. And actually took my boots off and got in the rice fields, which I had never done before. All of my years working in West Africa, I never barefoot in the rice fields. But trying to figure out if you could actually run through the rice fields, you cannot. I'm here to tell you that's not happening. And then getting out of the river, getting out of the fields up on the banks is probably how people got out and got to the boats and then run along the dike, which is the embankment of earth that holds the river back from the rice fields, or that separates the fields. I know this because as we were in the rice fields, we saw a baby alligator. There were always alligators, always alligators. So I learned a lot about them. And the scientists I was with, my friends, were joking. I was not joking. I was moving. I was trying to get up and out as quickly as possible. And I couldn't move as quickly as I wanted to. So I finally got to the edge and sort of tried to put my foot up. It was a pretty steep.
Yeah.
We had Ernie was driving the getaway car. He had to reach down and pull me up. So it's a little harder than it sounds. It sounds very romantic to think of freedom seekers running through the rice fields. It probably was not very orderly or romantic at all.
Living history.
Yes.
We're glad you survived.
Thank you.
I want to turn some questions over, but I want to get one last thought from you about why this matters today. Why is this important? And in order to help inspire, we began with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I want to move us to a 21st century poet, Natasha Trethewey, and her elegy for the Native Guards. If you've not read that, her beautiful poem, and I'll just give a quote from it, and then ask you to speak about why you think this is so important for us. So, Trethewey tells us, quote, "The daughters of the Confederacy have placed a plaque here. At the fort's entrance, each Confederate soldier's name raised hard in bronze. No names for the Native Guards, 2nd Regiment, Union men, Black Phalanx. What is monument to their legacy?" Why are we asking this now?
Well, because we don't know their stories. The Native Guards, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, the 1st and the 3rd, we don't know their names, and we should. And there should be memorials to the Black Civil War soldiers. There should be memorials to the freedom seekers who risked their lives for freedom. There should be, and there aren't. I think that, number one, we need to understand that enslaved people were historical actors and the actions they took for their own freedom. I think, number two, we need to tell their stories. We need to tell their stories, and the stories of, if we know anything, we know the names, say, of the 54th Massachusetts. We know the names of regiments of men who were freed before the Civil War. We need to also know the stories of those who were formerly enslaved, those who liberated themselves from bondage, those who risked their lives. Hector Fields is one, right? My 3rd great-grandfather risked his life so that other people could be free. We need to memorialize them.
Beautiful. We have a large landscape to populate in paper, in steel and stone. and celluloid. And I just want to thank you for your work in bringing this story to us, to the world. It's a monument, and it's monumental, honestly. And this book is phenomenal, y'all. Please pick it up, pour over it. But we've got about 15 minutes for your questions. There's a microphone over here. If you can't reach the microphone, I'll listen and I'll relay a question for you.
Hi, my name is Erica. I'm a friend of your mother's and your father's. With that being said, could you start from a more basic standpoint, which is if they were in South Carolina and Harriet Tubman was north, how did they come together?
Yeah. Thank you for that. And in hindsight, I should have said more about Harriet Tubman and about the new research I did and the new findings I have about Tubman. So I'll start here. Tubman arrives in Beaufort, South Carolina in late May 1862. She was sent by the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew. So this goes back to the Battle of Port Royal, which took place November 7th of 1861. The U.S. Navy drives its armada up Port Royal Sound, and the planters flee, right? The enslaved people by default are free. They're not legally free. They're no longer enslaved, and the U.S. Army refuses to return them to bondage. The U.S. Army occupies coastal South Carolina, Sea Islands, Beaufort, Port Royal, and begins the largest social movement in U.S. history, the Port Royal Experiment. So teachers come down, missionaries come down, people to supervise labor on Sea Island cotton plantations come down. These are all Northern abolitionists. Harriet Tubman comes down during this time period. She's not one of the volunteer teachers or whatever. She's sent as a spy. She's sent by the governor of Massachusetts to be a spy for the U.S. Army. And she ends up working in what we today call refugee camps. These are camps that are set up for freedom seekers who are coming from Confederate occupied territory in the interior, right? So the rice plantations, for example, and further into the interior, these people are coming and they know what's on the other side, right? They know about Confederate installations. They know about Confederate weapons. They know what's going on over there. So she debriefs them, we would call it today, in these refugee camps and gathers intelligence from them and passes it on to the U.S. Army. And George Garrison, who is William Lloyd Garrison's son and was with the 55th Massachusetts, says that Tubman made it her business to see each and every person who came from Confederate territory, and she gathered more intelligence than anybody else. So that intelligence becomes the foundation of the Combahee River Raid.
My name is Asa Gordon. I'm a research historian and consultant curator with the African American Civil War Museum. I just want to bring attention to a book that was written for Charon's book. It's called Swing Low, Sweet Harriet, and it's written by Rhonda Hicks Rucker. She's a folklorist, musician, and novelist. And her and her husband, Sparky Rucker, did a rendition of, now the reason why it's called Swing Low, Sweet Harriet, among the Gullers, it was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot when the master was near. It would say, swing low, sweet Harriet, swing low to the Lowcountry for to carry us home. So it's one of those code songs. Mm-hmm. And so this book is kind of interesting. It's written from the story of a kid that's on the one of the in DeSapio Island, and discovers a torpedo while he's crabbing in the marsh. So that's the theme of it. And so they find out that this is information that as a kid, it was interesting. It's taken from about 13 years old. He wants to get this information to Harriet. So I want to say to him, it's called Swing Low, Sweet Harriet. And it tells us from that story. It's fictional, but much of the information is factual as far as, what was occurring at that time. Now, I grew up in that era. I'm very familiar with the march, that era. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I'm very familiar with those march eras, and I explored some of those. I myself used to go up in rowboats along those rivers at the time. And I did some research on this particular subject at the time, but that's for another era.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that to us. One of the pieces of evidence that I uncovered about Tubman is that she, first of all, in her pension file, she says that she was a leader of men, 8 or 9, spies, scouts, and pilots. And she tells she gives an interview, this is in the 20th century, she also tells her nephew that her group of spies, scouts, and pilots found the men who put the torpedoes on the Combahee River. They supervised the removal of these torpedoes, which opens the river up to the U.S. Army boats. There's another teacher, I believe, from Massachusetts who talks about Tubman. Couple days after the raid, that's all anybody seemed to be talking about in Beaufort, right? And a lot of people wrote accounts. In addition to newspaper accounts, there are multiple accounts in people's papers and diaries and whatever about this raid and Colonel James Montgomery coming back with almost 800 formerly enslaved people. And a teacher talks about Tubman, she calls her Harriet Tubbs, going on the plantations and telling the people to come to the boats. And then, the plantations are burned down. So these were pieces about Tubman's role in the raid that are new. And they're new to Combahee.
I am Rick Houghton. I'm an Episcopal priest and I'm an amateur student of history. I am interested in the Combahee raid as a set piece of what a special ops raid should look like in terms of the good intelligence and relying on local people and not trying to mess it up with an idealistic white northerner trying to corner the shops, according to the book. Do they study this at the CIA? Do you have any idea?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if they study the raid. I know that they study Harriet Tubman.
Okay.
The CIA has if you look at the intelligence section of the CIA,
Thank you.
And Tubman was inducted as a full member of the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. And there were several very high CIA officials that wrote letters to support her nomination. She was inducted first as an honorary member, and Kate Larson and her great-great-great-grandniece, Tina Wyatt, worked very hard to have her inducted as a full member. So there's an entire dossier of CIA officials. So when I use words like debrief, this is the language that the intelligence community uses to describe Tubman's activities, and using it as a textbook case for intelligence activities.
Right. My name is Carolyn Brewer. I'm a children's book author. Thank you so much for writing this book. I'm interested in knowing what you knew about your grandfather before you started work on the book and what you learned as a result of it. Thank you.
Thank you. So Hector Fields was my third great-grandfather. All I knew about him really was what one of my cousins had gathered from the census. So it was a line of direct descendants from Hector Fields down to my dad. That was all we knew. We didn't know his other children. We didn't know. It was obvious from the census that, okay, it's a long story, but it was obvious that he was married more than one time, and that the wife of his son, who was our direct ancestor, was not the wife that was on the census. She was not old enough, right? So he was probably married in bondage and was separated by death or by, we didn't know what. So we didn't know siblings. All we knew is man to man, father to son, Hector down to my grandfather. Again, in partnering with the International African American Museum, it was the founder of the Center for Family History, Tony Carrier, who was helping me with the Requiem. And Tony had a theory that Hector, she had a theory and I had a theory that our family was freed in the raid, just because of the proximity of my dad's family, his mother and his father's families, to where the raid took place. And then we had Hector, and we knew a lot more about my grandmother's family than we did my grandfather's family, because the Fields family in Colleton County was so small. Then there's a cemetery. There's a plantation cemetery, and there's a lot of unmarked graves. And I went there looking for the Fields family graves, and I found the unmarked graves, and I couldn't make any sense of them. And there was a grave that was damaged, and it was open, and it was full of water, and my ancestors' skeletal remains floated at the top, and it completely threw me for a loop, and helped me to decide to change a lot of things, like, who is this history for, right? So Tony was helping me to work through all of that and make sense all of that, and to figure out who was buried in the cemetery and where were Hector Fields' descendants. And she found Jonas Fields' pension file. Jonas is Hector's brother. They both served. Jonas is in 128C, I believe. Hector doesn't have a pension file. Jonas does. In Jonas's pension file, their sister. Now, mind you, we didn't know we didn't know anything about Hector except his name and his son. Now Hector has a brother. Hector has a sister. She testifies about her two brothers, Hector and Jonas, who went to Colleton County to live in Hayward's rice fields, which is where the Fields family lives now that I know. Our family patriarch was Jonas. We didn't know that Jonas was a family name. And she named their parents. My fourth great-grandparents. And she talked about where Jonas, and their parents were enslaved in downtown Beaufort. Hector had to have been on a plantation, and he had to have been, I believe he was on Ladies Island, I'm not sure yet. But he had to be in U.S. occupied territory or closer to U.S. occupied territory, because he got away. He liberated himself, and he joins the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in March of 1863. Jonas was a house slave, and he was evacuated and taken, I believe, to Georgia and separated from his wife, who went crazy. And he doesn't get away until 1864. So that's what I learned about my family. And I have to say that we fixed the grave. We're still trying to identify most of the unmarked graves. We were able to identify one who was the last buried and to mark her grave. But I have a much better idea of who's buried in that cemetery because I found death certificates of family members that listed. There's still gaps, but we're a lot closer. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
I actually don't have a question. I just want to say, my name is Faith Ruffins, and I'm a curator at the Smithsonian. So I've known Edda for years, and I've known Paul for years. And I just want to say that the level of detail of research that has gone into this book is astonishing. And it's about people about whom you thought most people would have said, we can't find anything out about their lives. And it points to the importance of the pension files, not just for understanding the military part of it, because of but I just want to congratulate you on this fabulous book. But I also want to say that there are not enough of them. But in Washington, there is the African American Civil War Museum and Memorial, which is based on the stories of colored men who served, and also it talks about their families and their larger connection to African American culture. So I didn't want people in Washington to go away without knowing there is a memorial. It's at one of the entrances or exits to the U Street Green Line subway that lists almost all, but not actually all, of the names of these soldiers and sailors. So men and women, there are men and women on it. So I just wanted to say that and say congratulations. It's a fabulous book.
Thank you. Thank you, Faith.